Sometimes a little focus is so critical. Hi, I'm Pastor Allen, and welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. When I was a kid, sometimes we would play with a magnifying glass. We would take a piece of wood or paper, and we'd lay it on the sidewalk in the bright summer sun. Now, you leave it to itself, that paper or wood's probably going to sit there all day and barely get warm. However, when we took a magnifying glass, we could focus the sun's rays on a particular spot, and in no time, the paper or the wood would catch on fire. In fact, when I was in Scouts, our troop once built a solar cooker as a project for a Scout exhibition. We got our hands on an old radar dish. We stretched a piece of reflective mylar across it, and then we used a vacuum cleaner to suck all the air out, forming a concave mirror. We built a frame that we could put this thing on, and then we would stick hot dogs in the focal point of that mirror. And we actually got pretty good at cooking hot dogs quickly in that heat. As long as we didn't leave them on there too long, then they would tend to get a little extra crispy. A lack of focus can be detrimental, leading to wasted energy and effort. Henry Ford used to say that a lack of focus is a major human weakness. And when he woke up with too many ideas in his mind, he would go run around the outside of his house until his mind cleared and he could settle on just one thought. And then that thought would be the first thing he devoted his energy to on that day. Focus is also important for people and for churches. Without focus, we can waste a lot of energy on things that really have no lasting significance. With the right focus, we can harness our energy to accomplish some pretty incredible things. The New Testament letter of 1 John is about having the right focus. In this letter, we have one of Jesus' best friends on earth, the Apostle John, writing to encourage a group of second and third generation believers. Now, before we get really into the text of this letter, let's talk for a minute about why we, in fact, believe this letter was written by the Apostle John. Because believe it or not, in recent times, some people have raised some doubts about that claim. 1 John is one of only two letters in the New Testament that don't give us any information as to the identity of the author in its introduction. The other letter that's true of is the letters of the Hebrews. The letters of 2 John and 3 John at least refer to somebody known as the elder who was the author. However, when it comes to 1 John, the best evidence available points to the Apostle John as the author of the letter. Christian commentators were associating this letter with the Apostle John as early as the mid-2nd century, and that's within living memory of when the letter was first published. Also, if you set this letter side by side with the Gospel of John, we find a remarkable similarity in vocabulary, style, and themes, enough to build a pretty good case that they were written by the same person. And since the evidence points to the Apostle John as the most likely candidate for writing the fourth gospel, then it's likely he wrote this letter as well. They're that similar. In the letter's introduction, the author writes, "What was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've seen with our eyes, what we've looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, and this life was manifested, and we have seen and testify and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we've seen and we heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. Indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete." And in this introduction, notice the author repeatedly claims to have been an eyewitness of Jesus and appears to identify himself with apostolic authority. In fact, throughout the letter, he includes himself among those who are authorized to speak authoritatively against false teachers. He speaks to his audience only as an apostle. He speaks to his audience as only an apostle could get away with doing. Based on all the above, including the parallels with the Gospel of John, then the most likely candidate for authorship is John the Apostle. So what was John the Apostle like? Well, John apparently was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, of Jesus' original 12 disciples. Even among those disciples, John enjoyed a special relationship with Jesus. John was included in a group of 3 disciples who were considered Jesus' inner circle, along with his own brother James and their friend Peter. Several times in his gospel, John refers to himself obliquely as the one whom Jesus loved. And we only know that John's referring to himself because this disciple whom Jesus loved is described in situations where the other gospel writers place John. John's also described as sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper, which would be a position normally reserved for a very close friend. One other interesting fact about John: according to church history, he was the only one of the 12 apostles who did not die a violent death. Although it wasn't for lack of trying. In fact, the painting there on the screen is a 15th century depiction of John reportedly surviving a bath in boiling oil. John apparently survived attempts to torture and kill him, and then spent a considerable amount of time exiled to a remote island. So if John wrote this letter, who exactly was John writing to? Well, apparently he was writing to a group, to a church or a group of churches who were very special to him. Throughout the letter, he refers to them as dear children, and he speaks to them as a father would speak to his child. The most likely scenario is that this was a church or a group of churches that John had helped to plant. John was concerned that this congregation he loved was in danger of losing focus and being led astray by false teaching. Repeatedly in the letter, John refers to deceivers, false teachers, antichrist, and to testing the spirits to see if they're from God. John apparently was concerned about a group of teachers who were casting doubts on Jesus' messiahship, his humanity, or in some cases even both of those things. Now, in the letter's introduction, John draws our attention back to the proclamation of the good news about Jesus. The first 4 verses are actually one long sentence in Greek. The main verb doesn't even appear until verse 3, and it's the words "we proclaim." The content of that proclamation, according to John, is the word of life. John's point is that Jesus is God's ultimate word to us about life and salvation. This word is identified clearly in John's gospel. In the introduction to the Gospel of John, we read, "In the beginning was the Word." A few verses later, John continues, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." John, and here John means John the Baptist, not himself, John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me.'" Of course, the one about whom John the Baptist was speaking there was Jesus. The purpose of this word is also identified in the introduction to John's gospel. In John 1, verses 9 through 13, we read, "There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Others have also recognized the significance of this word made flesh. The introduction to the letter to the Hebrews tells us, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the world. Jesus has always been part of God's plan to redeem lost human beings. When John refers to what was from the beginning, he's using that phrase in 2 senses. First, John has in mind the beginning of the world. Going back to what he wrote in the introduction to his gospel, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it." However, John also has in mind the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, when John and the rest of the original disciples had a ringside seat to hear Jesus say things only God has the right to say, while doing things that only God has the power to do. And that's how John's able to speak as an eyewitness to Jesus' life and ministry. Behind all this is the idea that when we deal with Jesus, we are dealing with God himself. In 1 John, he asserts that this word was with the Father in the beginning. And he clearly associates God the Father with the Son, Jesus Christ. Of course, in his gospel, John clearly states that the Word, whom he identifies as Jesus, was God. In other words, God's plan to save humanity is not some abstract philosophical idea, but revolves around a person and an event that occurred literally in history. This Word was manifested in human flesh. John and his fellow apostles had heard, seen, and touched this living Word. In proclaiming Jesus, John and his fellow apostles testified about what they'd experienced personally and what Jesus had commissioned them to say. John clearly believed that Jesus was this word sent from God, and he invites his readers to share in that belief. He writes, "What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ." In other words, when we put our faith in Jesus, we experience a special connection not only with God, but also with other believers. Finally, John suggests that when we share Jesus with others, we find our ultimate fulfillment. He writes, "These things we write that our joy may be made complete." Indeed, for a follower of Jesus, one of the most rewarding experiences around is to be able to share the message of Jesus with another person and then to watch that person come to faith as well. We ignore reality at our peril. Sometimes we subscribe to false ideas that prevent us from seeing reality clearly. I heard a story a while back about the tragic sinking of the Titanic. Reportedly, one of the first radio operators to pick up the Titanic's distress call was rebuffed by his supervisor. The head man couldn't believe that the great ship could sink. So as a result, he said the distress call was a hoax, and he chewed out the radio operator. And as a result, search and rescue efforts were delayed, and many people died who might otherwise have been saved. In Jesus, God has spoken his ultimate word to us. Will we be able to receive that word and respond with urgency? Or will we dismiss it, ignore it, and miss God's message of salvation? If you want to know more, reach out to me in the comments or send me a note at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. If you enjoyed this session, please give it a like and share it with a friend. Next time, we're going to explore a little more in depth the contents of this message God was trying to send to us through Jesus. Until then, keep seeking to walk in the light and in God's truth.